The deception with tact. Just what are you trying to say? You got a blank face, which irritates. Communicate, pull out your party piece. You see dimensions in two. State your case with black or white. But when one little cross leads to shots, grit your teeth. You run for cover so discreet, why don't they? Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And in my humble opinion, in such a dispiriting political moment, we're certainly fortunate that while cooler heads ought to have applied a little more of their critical energy to making an affirmative case for taking power and actually doing something good for all the people who live in this god-forsaken colonial dystopia, and a little less to just commanding the media and trusting that humanity would win out through the arts alone, we're certainly fortunate, given that we don't seem to have lost the battle over the popular arts, at least not just yet, that we get to have movies like veteran auteur Paul Thomas Anderson's latest production, One Battle After Another, an epic, absurdist political action thriller that pits the frayed edges of a far-left revolutionary militant cell against a now nationally deployed special forces unit led by a sexually deranged white supremacist, all set against the tightening noose of anti-migrant persecution. The aforementioned far-left militant cell, the French 75, is ostensibly a decentralized org, but its de facto power couple is explosive expert ghetto Pat Calhoun, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and propagandist Perfidia Beverly Hills. She's portrayed by Teyana Taylor, the acclaimed choreographer, dancer, singer, rapper, and actress who had a big year back in 2023 with her roles in both 1001 and The Book of Clarence. I recommend both of those films for Taylor's performances alone, especially the former. One Battle After Another opens with Perfidia spearheading an assault upon and liberation of a Southern California migrant detention facility, with the patently down bad Ghetto Pat providing a coup de grace fireworks show. It is the first militant action that leads the fiery and shameless Perfidia to cross paths with the leader of the detention facility's commander, Colonel Stephen J. Lockjaw, here played by the simultaneously hilarious and utterly repulsive Sean Penn. And if it weren't for the very outlandish names of some of these characters, it should be obvious that the setting of One Battle After Another is a few steps over the line from typical political action thriller territory right into the darkest cloud cuckoo land, especially when, in her capture of Lockjaw, taking note of his grotesque flirtation with her even as she points a gun right at him, Perfidia coerces Lockjaw into gaining an erection before having him zip-tie his wrists and march him into the cage where he and his men are left as the French 75 flee into the night. Ghetto Pat and Perfidia sharing an exhibitionist moment together in the back of the getaway car as Perfidia taunts his fetish for black women and Pat uproariously assents to it. The French 75 continues perpetrating various vandalistic and militant acts over a number of years, with the obsessed Lockjaw now stalking Perfidia. But in an absolutely mind-boggling twist, this is where you turn the review off before you get spoiled. I know, right? We're not even a half hour into this movie and there's already a crazy f***ing spoiler? Okay, so while Perfidia is still continuing to have a relationship with Pat, and even after the two of them have a child together, she begins a sadomasochistic relationship with Lockjaw, ostensibly giving into his own perverse fetish to be dominated by a militant black woman to stop him from divulging what he knows about the French 75 and their activities. But it's clear that there's a little bit more going on underneath the hoodie in a very psychosexual manner. Pat literally ends up retreating into the background, doing his best to care for his and Perfidia's daughter, and when she traipses out at nights, the line between her official duties with the French 75 and her unofficial infidelity with Lockjaw begins to blur. But after a bank robbery goes bad, the crackdown on the French 75 is finally at hand, with Lockjaw Lockjaw himself leading the battalion. Perfidia herself is arrested and flipped state's witness, several key members are assassinated, and the rest are forced to scatter to the winds and go into hiding. 16 years later, Pat now goes by the name Bob Ferguson and lives alone with his now high school-age daughter Willa, played by Chase Infinity. After being left to their own devices for so many years, Pat has wasted away into Margaritaville, whereas his daughter is a strong, confident, politically correct young woman. She's even a youth karate champion. But I guess you might see where this is going. It isn't long before the wolves of the past, one particular swaggering wolf himself, Lockjaw, come scratching at the door. Then again, most thrillers involving reckonings from the past are not so politically explicit as Anderson's script for One Battle After Another, to say nothing about how they are never this overtly depraved in terms of the explicit role that sexual desire plays in the story. But that's all par of the course when one considers one of the key inspirations for One Battle After Another, that being the 1990 novel Vineland, written by the acclaimed and reclusive postmodernist author Thomas Pynchon, for whom silly names, convoluted and unconventional narrative structures, and just shamelessly crude humor are key signatures. Of course, Anderson previously officially adapted one of Pynchon's novels, that being Inherent Vice, back in 2014, which, to date, makes Anderson still the only filmmaker to whom Pynchon has consented to the live-action adaptation of his works. Now, this is where I once again reiterate that I am a dilettante. I've read one Thomas Pynchon novel, and it wasn't Vineland, and even so far as I'm aware that One Battle After Another is only loosely adapted from Pynchon as inspiration, I'll refrain from making any commentary on One Battle After Another in dialogue with that novel, except to say that while Pynchon's novel takes place against the backdrop of the war on drugs in the mid-80s, One Battle After Another is a somehow even stranger beast, at least generationally and temporally. It isn't precisely clear when the events of the film are supposed to take place, at least not at first, although everything from the foregrounding of the migrant detention, the militarization of the border, the prominence of smartphones, even in the long inciting preamble to the narrative before we flash forward to Willa being all grown up, all of that points to a contemporary setting, but you can tell not only from the rather anachronistic politics and portrayal of the French 75 themselves that we are in much stranger, indeed absurdist territory, so transparently absurd that even as we flash forward in the film, finding Willa in a karate dojo, we are greeted by actress Chase Infinity giving a very brief voiceover narration in which she says, "In 16 years, not much changes." I think a very overt signal by Anderson to his audience that we are in the exaggerated realm of satire, that One Battle After Another takes place in a kind of zone of temporal collapse, really, where the seemingly repetitive cycles of history, or more especially American political history, seem to all kind of flatten onto each other. This actually proves to be not just a neat narrative or aesthetic ploy, but actually does a lot to add layers to the black comedy of the film. It occurs to you the more you watch, especially DiCaprio's performance as Pat or Bob, that this is an over 50-year-old actor playing a guy who seems, from the moment we meet him, eternally adrift between the ages of 35 and 46, never quite youthful, but only sort of washed up and not haggard, and yet the way he talks is like he was one of the original Lords of Dogtown. Even when Anderson plays at generational clashes as Pat is reluctantly pulled out of the purple haze to wrestle with the demons of the past, the irony becomes that there isn't really that much distinction. Even the character of militant youth counterculture doesn't seem to have changed that much. I may not have read Vineland, but I've seen enough movies to intuit that Anderson is clearly drawing just as much upon his own well of cinematic influences, and the tone of One Battle After Another, the tone that it strikes, if I had to put it simply, it's like if you crossed a dour, prescient dystopia like Children of Men with Pineapple Express. And that's what sort of makes One Battle After Another such a bizarre but effective delight to experience. It was absolutely insane to me when I finally checked on this film's running time and realized that it was nearly 3 hours. And yes, I did decide to go see this without even bothering to see how long it was. And let me tell you, even if I will admit there were some stretches of this that I found a little tedious, I really don't think DiCaprio has as much flexibility to breathe within Anderson's penchant for at once being so formally meticulous as a filmmaker while also still providing lots of room for improvisation and inhabiting of character. It's a good performance, but I think some parts of One Battle After Another do suffer from DiCaprio being given a little bit of too much of not a lot to do for so long. I'll still say it, this did not feel like 3 hours. This barely felt like 2 hours, which is crazy to me, given that One Battle After Another is, on the one hand, just this absolutely crack-brained story filled with the sort of vulgarian humor that even Jodie Hill might be too afraid to touch. This is, at its heart, an incredibly lewd stoner comedy that just happens to choose for its setting a very credible and honestly kinda too close to the truth to not be tasteless political thriller. But it's not just the backdrop and costumes. I think One Battle After Another is a genuine feat for this year, a year in which I really don't think a lot of filmmakers wrapping up projects they were working on had nearly as much of a clue as to how disastrous the political situation was going to get in this country under the white Christian fascist regime that we're still only 1 year into. For every other obviously way more horrible thing that's going on right now, from the persecution of migrants from the global south to the ever more frothing, virulent hatred towards trans and non-binary people to the continuing genocide in Gaza to the death by 1,000 cuts, or rather now, I guess, 1,000 deep compound slashes that is being done to any sort of notion of regulation of finance or industry or the infringement of religion on the public commons or public health. A lot of shit went down just this year, and it's so odd to see a guy like Paul Thomas Anderson, someone who has never really been known for or interpreted as a political filmmaker, coming through with this screw-loose stoner comedy political thriller that could not be better timed to both debatably to cheapen all of those real problems, but alternately to provide just the right kind of sneering, unapologetically crass, satirical hit job that you're even capable of getting through the door in Hollywood, not like our popular cinema hasn't been mining the anxiety and political discontent and especially the costuming of socially conscious, left-leaning politics for some time. But what's great about One Battle After Another, what makes it work so well even in this fraught moment, in a way that so many of those Hollywood pandering Che Guevara t-shirt movies don't, isn't that it isn't using radical politics as a patina, as a costume, as a set dressing. It's that in its own satiric way, it kind of acknowledges that this is exactly what it's doing. And if anything, the movie is sort of a vindication of that kind of sense of radical chic. If anything, you could say that exactly why Taylor's Perfidia, her name literally alluding to perfidiousness, why this character remains so genuinely, seriously, dramatically compelling, no matter how absurd her sexual behavior gets. And before anyone says it, no, I do not think we're supposed to interpret her actions as purely coerced. I think it's actually really important to this character and thus to the movie that Taylor's absolutely mesmerizing 1,000-yard stare is branded upon thereout. It's actually really important that she willingly makes this betrayal, that she is a psychosexual character in her own right, that's what draws her and Lockjaw together in the first place, and honestly gets her to both filially and then fraternally turn on Pat. One Battle After Another is a film full of characters who are vaingloriously wearing costumes, and I think the rather powerful point that Anderson is probing with this film is whether or not this attempting to discredit radicalism as a costume is itself a cheap shot. That far from radical chic being a slander, what this film's portrayal of the French 75 does is explore the potential that the costume, that the decoration, that the chic of radicalism is absolutely essential to a movement's survival. No matter how absurd it is on the surface, and that you ought to get used to that fact, because guess what? These up white supremacist Christo-fascists are wearing their own costumes and decorations too, and they're really feeling themselves. So even if some of those old radicals or young skater punks, or in another case, the gracious Benicio del Toro as a new agey karate instructor who also helps migrants flee in what he literally describes as a new underground railroad, these things may come off as kind of goofy. But while you're cringing, your enemy, all of our enemies, are winning in the battle of illusions, of costumes and pageantry. And it turns out those things are actually kind of really important to giving people the ability to just feel themselves, or I guess for the right wing, and especially related to the portrayal of both Pat and Lockjaw in this movie, to kind of goon them into power. There's a really incisive satirical point just in Perfidia's whole arc as a character, which of course, ironically, turns out to not be totally perfidious. At a certain point, you need to realize that this absurd pageantry is part of what makes us human. It's how we hold on to these things. It's how we tell stories. It's how we impart and make messages travel. It's not the dry text or lecturing. It's the part where we give into the absurd because, even just the idea of seriously posing a threat to this white Christian supremacist power structure is gonna be a little absurd. Putting your ass on the line is gonna feel a little absurd. Like, why would I even think it was possible for us to be successful like this? But you gotta get froggy with it. You gotta own it. And if you don't own it, somebody is going to own you. There is just this incredible balance that Anderson is able to strike here between just hysterical, mad black comedy. I'm pretty dead certain Sean Penn has based at least the way Lockjaw walks on Vince McMahon. And as far as anybody who's concerned that this is just going to turn out to be a movie in which a white star is paired with absolutely one of the baddest black women alive, only to just kind of be a milquetoasty, mopey white savior in this story all about fighting the most depraved extremes of a white supremacist regime, besides Children of Men and Pineapple Express, One Battle After Another would make a great double feature with Big Trouble in Little China, and that's all I'm gonna say on that. I'm fighting like hell to not just spoil every awesome, hilarious thing in this movie, and every genius conceit that only pays off as you settle in and let those 3 hours melt away without feeling much of those 3 hours. It's a hilarious movie, but there is also just such a profoundly effective pathos to it. This movie has already got some right-wing heads up in arms about it, and while it may look silly to see a headline in which Anderson claims he wasn't inspired by contemporary politics for this film, I don't think he's being an ironist. I don't think he's trying to troll his haters. I absolutely believe him to an extent. I really do think that for Anderson, this really was just a happy little accident. That for somebody who has devoted himself so much to period pieces, from Boogie Nights to The Master to There Will Be Blood, this is a man who is absolutely obsessed by time passing and by the haunting echoes of the past. And I really do think that for him, One Battle After Another is primarily an exercise in political collage. There are going to be political sympathies nestled in there, but mostly I see his interest as an artist in precisely that line by Willa. In 16 years, nothing much changes. What does anybody find with any sufficient reading of American history if not repetitions of one ongoing meta-narrative, with one battle after another, all of it seeming to infinitely recur upon itself right up to the present moment, where a lot of us are thinking, someone really ought to have completed the Reconstruction. And it's because Anderson is not an expressly political filmmaker. It is because he, in fact, makes a joke in the film about how political cinema ultimately becomes a boutique consumer commodity. There's literally a scene where Pat passes out stoned on the couch while watching his Criterion DVD copy of the Battle of Algiers. Anderson's not so much apolitical as non-political intuition in crafting this film is precisely what gives it so much dramatic weight as a political thriller. The ensemble of the film are practically phantoms of history in an infinitely recurring purgatory, and because no real political tendency is inscribed on the narrative, Anderson allows his audience to view these cringy, half-cocked, absurd, sometimes downright perverted lefty militants as genuinely identifiable people who any of us could be or become under the right or rather the wrong circumstances. Some of us are going to become the virtually useless stoned out Bob watching like Soy Cuba or whatever and being like, yeah, that's that shit, comrade. Some of us, just putting it out there, gonna be out of pocket for a second, some of us are absolutely batted out black women who still end up making deals with the devil, not just because their arm is twisted, but because we are individuals, and that's where some of our hearts and our loins lead us sometimes. It's absurd, it's a satirical extreme, but the way Anderson executes those absurdities, the heights to which he shoots, is balanced only by his ability to bring us back down into a beautiful close-up in which we realize no matter how ludicrous some of these characters are, we are still peering into the soul of an identifiable human being. Which means that Anderson can sustain this high-wire act. He can keep this thing going as off-the-wall and goofy as he wants, but we find ourselves still so sucked into the gravity of the story and the struggle that the characters are fighting. We still feel a genuine pang for what they've failed to achieve, and we still can't help but root them on to another Pyrrhic triumph. I think it's a beautiful film and an incredibly funny one. I'm giving one battle after another a 3.5 out of 5. With that, I'm tapping out. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.